psalm in two different parts, kind of cutting this in half. Look at the first 17 verses, 1 through 17 tonight, and then tomorrow, or next week, we'll look at the last group there. But Psalm 102, in my Bible, it labels this as the lonely psalm, and then the header on it is a prayer of the afflicted when he is overwhelmed and poureth out his complaint before the Lord. The lonely psalm. And so some people believe that this psalm would have been written around, if the date's significant, it's 538 BC. That's when Jerusalem fell. That's when Daniel was led away as a captive. That's when Jeremiah was taken away, and I think he was led off to Egypt. But that's when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. And that was a very, very terrible, tragic time, not just physically, but spiritually, especially for Daniel, those who knew the Lord, because they knew exactly what had happened. They knew why it was happening. And to see the long-term decay spiritually up to that point was just horrific. And then finally to see God's judgment hit that city and have to walk away, led into exile, seeing God's jewel, God's Zion, burning to the ground. The temple, that was a hard thing to see, to the beautiful temple that Solomon built, destroyed. And so some people think that maybe Daniel or Jeremiah himself wrote this psalm. We don't know for sure exactly. But these psalms at the very end here are kind of sometimes not always in as much of a close group date-wise as we would think, but kind of spread out over some period of time. So added during different times as remembering times of celebration or times of sorrow, remembering some of these special psalms. So two, possibly written on Daniel, Jeremiah's time. And the first two verses I label as, kind of with the point or the header, please listen. We see the first two verses of Psalm 102. It says, hear my prayer, O Lord, and let my cry come unto thee. Hide not thy face from me in the day when I am in trouble. Incline thy ear unto me in the day when I call. Answer me speedily. So he's making four different requests to God there. He's saying, hear me, let my cry come to you, don't hide your face to me, okay, and incline your ear. When I call, please answer me right away. Please bend down your ear. You think of that. I always picture a parent listening to a child. You know, the child's pretty down there, pretty low. We're talking very quietly. You bend down low. You want to hear what they had to say, and that's the same idea. Picture a God, a great, powerful God, sitting in his throne room. Bend down and listen to me, God. It's my own little trouble, I know, but it's overwhelming right now. Please listen to my complaint. Hear me. Let my cry come to you. Don't turn your face away. And that is more leading to a spiritual motive or a spiritual reference there, because when God's face was toward Israel, and this is a part of covenants and promises that God has made over the time to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to his 12 sons, to David, it was, my face is going to shine upon you. When your face shines upon you, when God's face shines especially, there's blessing. There's a lot of protection. There's profit and great gain. It's very a wonderful time. But when God turns his face away, as he turned his face away from his son when he was dying on the cross, when Jesus was dying on the cross, God turned his face away. Don't do that now, God. We're in trouble. Please don't do that. I'm in trouble. Please listen to me. And I like that last phrase, answer me speedily. Answer me speedily. And like I said before, I think this is coming from a heart of a lot of desperation, a lot of sadness, because I think, especially this author probably should have known, God answers every prayer. Whether it's the answer we like, he still answers. But when we don't get the answer we want, that's when we start making those requests, and they're genuine requests. They may not always be by the book accurate, but God knows our hearts. He knows when we're frustrated and upset, and he knows, okay, I have answered you. I am going to, I think of the Taylors, Yes, he might pass away. That's not what people have been praying for. People haven't been praying for that. What are you doing, God? You're not answering our prayer. Well, he did answer. He did answer. Not the request, not the way we want to, but he did answer. But I think it's totally, I wouldn't call out this author and writing something that's wrong or having the wrong heart, because God knows our hearts. But please, the request here is, please answer me speedily. Answer me. Fix the situation I'm in. I'm in a terrible situation here. Verse 3 through 9 speak of the physical impact of sorrowing. He's so desperate. He so wants to hear God answer his prayer, because verses 3 through 9 is a pretty terrible situation to physically be in. These are physical things he's suffering with. Verse 3, for my days are consumed like smoke. My bones are burned as an hearth, or in a hearth. My heart is smitten, and withereth like grass, so that I forget to eat my bread. By reason of the voice of my groaning, my bones cleave to my skin. I am like a pelican of the wilderness. I am like an owl of the desert. I watch and am a sparrow alone upon the housetop. My enemies reproach me all the day, and they that are mad against me are sworn against me. For I have eaten ashes like bread, and mingled my drink with weeping. Pretty desperate situation. I mean, his spiritual struggles, his physical sorrowing has affected his body, which we all know that happens. We've all probably experienced that ourselves. He says, my days are consumed like smoke. I think of the first year we were here, we had that really bad grass fire, 50,000 acres, over 50,000 acres burned, or I wasn't anywhere near when 9/11, in that area, but all that smoke, just black smoke, just billowing out as the towers fell, the Pentagon was hit, terrible things, and you see all those things burning and all those things being consumed by fire, and then they're gone, and all that's left is smoke. Just chemistry-wise, why that happens, smoke just lifts up and it's gone. It blows away, and those precious things, those people, possessions are gone, just like smoke. And so the author is saying here, it's like I'm looking back and I'm seeing Jerusalem in smoke. That was my life. That was where I lived. That's where I played. That's where I grew up. That's where my family is. And it's just consumed like smoke. My days are like that. They're just gone. All that's left is being blown away, evaporated into the wind, gone. My bones are burned as in a hearth. Physically, just the aches and pains and just the stress of anxiety and wondering and all that just affecting your body down to the bones. My heart is smitten, and that idea word smitten can mean it just has a general idea of being deeply affected. So it can be I've heard people say you're smitten in a romantic way. In this case, it's not. It's just saying my heart is hurting. My heart is deeply affected by the things that are happening around me. My heart is smitten. And withers like the grass. And grass is one of those things, if it's not kept up, if it's not watered on a regular basis, it dies pretty quickly. You can see the impacts of grass dying very, very fast. Other plants may last a little while if they're heat resistant. Grass isn't like that. I suppose some varieties can do that, but most of the time, grass is one of those things that you don't expect to last the winter. It's going to die. It's going to come back, but it withers and dies. If that was how your heart was, that the status of your life, if your life went down, up and down in those kind of situations, if your life was that delicate in the sense of the yard's dying, my heart in a sense is dying as I see the things around me happening. That's a pretty bad place to be in. So bad, he forgets to eat. I forgot to eat my bread. I forget to eat my bread. Verse 5, by reason of my groanings, his own voice, his own crying out to God has caused his bones to cleave to his skin. He's losing weight. He's stopped eating. He's so focused on the sorrowful state he's in. He knows spiritually what's happening, and later on he acknowledges who's bringing about this judgment. He knows all that, and that's leading to the impact of more and more sorrow, because he knows that God's brought this on. The reason they deserve it, and they do deserve it. It's not just bad luck. It's God bringing this judgment on him, and that's hurting him more. And the fact that it's burned and it's gone. And if this was Daniel or Jeremiah, they knew the prophecy that it was going to be 70 years. So they knew this was just getting started. And this time of exile was just beginning, and maybe they'll never get back home to Jerusalem. And so all this just keeps pounding upon him. He's forgetting to eat. He's losing weight. Verses 6 and 7 speak of a natural world, kind of very vivid picture for us to think of. I am like a pelican of the wilderness. Now, if you've ever seen a pelican, I've seen a few. They're always by water. Okay, a pelican needs to be. That's what they're birds that fish. They're by oceans, and I've seen some by the Gulf of Mexico. They shouldn't be in a desert. The idea there is that you've taken a bird or an animal and you've put it in the wrong habitat. So they're going to be lonely. They're not going to be able to survive. They're probably going to die. This bird is not going to last. The pelican cannot live in a wilderness or desert situation. I'm like an owl of the desert. An owl needs to be in a wooded area, in an area where he can hide and sleep during the day and hunt during the night, and a lot of I think of where I've seen owls, in some deep wooded areas. They shouldn't be in the desert. They shouldn't be where there's not a whole lot of tall shrub. That doesn't work. That owl's not going to be able to survive. I watch and am as a sparrow, or the Hebrew word here is any kind of bird by themselves on the top of a roof. You see birds many, many times. They're in flocks. They're in groups. 2 or 3 at a time. You see them on the. I just think of as a kid, remember seeing them on the telephone lines, something like that. Birds are in groups together. You see one lonely bird. That can happen now and then, but they're lonely. The idea is he's lonely. He doesn't have his companions around him. He feels like God's abandoned him. He feels like those that he would rely on to have at least that camaraderie of a relationship are gone. They've left. They've either died or they've been exiled along with him. They're all in the same spiritual, difficult, struggling boat right now. And then his enemies, they reproach him all the day long. And I think that would be the worst thing. If you were attacked, or whether it was physically attacked, or spiritually attacked, or emotionally attacked, to have it happen all day, to never have a break, to never even have a break of, oh, that was tough. Sit back and relax just for an hour, just for a little while, but just keep pounding and pounding that reproach, the idea of reproach, and I think I've said this before, is to speak in a disapproving way, just to not just say, I don't like you, but this is why I don't like you. I don't like you because of your faith. I don't like you because of what you've said here. I don't like you because of what you believe, and just attacking and attacking and attacking. And these enemies, the Babylonians, they had no respect at all for the Israelites' religion, their belief in God. In fact, those who were faithful knew exactly what was happening, and it was sad to see crude, unsanctified warriors from another country to come in and say, we're going to touch the holy things of the temple. We're going to destroy the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to touch the golden cups that should only have been touched by the high priest. And that's what's happening to our precious Jerusalem city. That would have just added insult to injury. And so you have these enemies coming in. They're disrespecting God's people. They're disrespecting the special elements of Jerusalem that were God's. And they that are mad against me are sworn against me. It constantly happens, constantly coming, constant reproach, constant attacks. Last verse 9 there. I have eaten ashes like bread and mingled my drink with weeping. And the idea there is Jewish customs would have been, and this would have happened even before this time, if there was a loss, a person died, the family members, and sometimes others would come in and do this, they would take ashes and throw them on their head. And you would put on a rough garment, like a what they call it, sackcloth. You put that on to show I'm in weeping now. A loved one has died or something terrible has happened, and they'd throw ashes on their head. And think of doing that so often, you're going to get some in your mouth. You're obviously going to get some ashes in your mouth as you're throwing it over your head. And he's saying that so often, it's like I'm eating them. That's how bad it's gotten. It's like I'm eating ashes. I've thrown this over my head so often in mourning, and my drink I have tears in it. Now, again, David did this. I don't know exactly who wrote this, but we have to realize that there's some poetic licensing here. Is he drinking a whole cup of his tears? Other Psalms, David says he sat in his couch and the couch floated away because of his tears. That obviously didn't happen. But yes, his drink probably got some tears in it because he was just crying so often he couldn't even stop to eat without weeping and just being overwhelmed by how terrible the situation was. And verses 10 and 11 is the third section. It's the reason for the suffering. And this is what I think makes this all the more harder for the author here, for Daniel, let's say. It says, because of thy indignation, verse 10, because of thy, or God's indignation, and because of your wrath, God, for thou hast lifted me up and cast me down. My days are like a shadow, they decline, and I am withered like grass. So it's you, God. He's not blaming him. He's not saying, why'd you do this? He's never, we see earlier in the psalm him questioning, please listen to me, please answer me. This phrase here, these two verses here, he's just saying the fact, I know exactly who brought this. I know exactly who allowed the Babylonians to rise up. They were a nobody people. A few years or a decade earlier, they were nobody. You raised them up, you allowed them to become strong, you allowed them to take over the city. It's because of your anger toward us, your wrath. And it was rightly so. We abandoned the rules and the standards that you had for the priests. You had social rules you wanted us to follow. We disregarded those. They abused and used the widows and those who are less fortunate. They took money away from the poor. There was means within the temple worship system to allow for provision for people that needed it. That was taken away. There was a lot of abuse. Spiritually, there was sacrifices weren't done in a way that was honoring the Lord. There was a lot of things happening. And so God was very upset with his people. He said, if you do this, I'm going to punish you. So it happened. It happened exactly as they said. The phrase, you lifted me up to cast me down. One theologian was actually, Spurgeon was a famous guy back in England, probably maybe 100 years ago. And he made the phrase that this sounds like, and even back then, like a professional wrestler would, just to show off, to lift him up and then to slam him to the ground. Is God doing that for dramatic reasons? The idea of just, he allowed the nation to rise up. He did allow the nation to have good days. In fact, things were so good that people were actually making fun of Jeremiah, saying, guys, listen, judgment is coming. No, it's not, Jeremiah. Look around. Everything's fine. We're doing wonderfully. Everything's growing. Things are happening. In the physical realm, things looked great. Spiritually, they were blind to those things. And so, was God allowing there to be some false security? I think he lets that happen. I think the days of Noah are like that. I think probably Sodom and Gomorrah thought nothing's going to happen. There was a lot of from the physical viewpoint, things are fine. God's allowing that to occur, and then, bam, judgment comes. My days are like a shadow. We know every time you study a shadow or look at those as a child, and you start seeing the patterns of those, they don't last. they decline. You see a shadow in the morning, and it pulls back, and it's no longer there by a certain time in the rest of the day. If this author is seeing his days like that, that's pretty desperate. He's wondering, am I even going to live? Am I even going to survive these next few years? I don't know. I wither like grass again. I decline. I wither like grass. He's wondering about his own life. In these last 5 verses here, turn around and he's looking at his own life, and I think this shows, even though this has been a lot of negativity in these first 11 verses, the author's saying all this, I think, with the right heart attitude, though, because he takes his own life and he turns around and compares that to God. He says in verse 12, "But thou, O Lord, shall endure forever." I don't know if I'm going to live I don't know if I'm going to live tomorrow. I don't know if I'm ever going to see Jerusalem again. Okay, but you, O Lord, you'll endure forever, and thy remembrance unto all generations. Thou shalt arise and have mercy upon Zion, for the time to favor her, yea, the set time is come. For thy servants take pleasure in her stones, and favor the dust thereof. So the heathen shall fear the name of the Lord, and all the kings of the earth thy glory. When the Lord shall build up Zion, he shall appear in his glory. He will regard the prayer of the destitute, and know and not despise their prayer. So he's saying, again, here's my short, uncertain life. Looking at you, God, you'll endure forever, though. In fact, you'll be remembered in the next generation, the next one after that. Okay, you're going to remember us. And I think that's an important thing to make note of is that right now, Israel's probably thinking, what's happened to our God? I thought he made promises to us. I thought he was going to. Why is he letting this happen? He hasn't forgotten Israel. There's the next generation. There's the next one after that. And I thought of this too. It was just even as another part of Israel's history, when God said, for 40 years, I'm going to let you guys wander in the wilderness for 40 years. He wanted to knock out a whole generation of parents to early grandparents at that time. Why would God do that? He was just waiting for the next generation. His timetable was completely different than Moses and Aaron and all those other people were thinking about. They thought, well, we've earned it. We deserve this. God says, no, you haven't. You disobeyed me. You turned your back on me. Moses and Aaron repeatedly had, unfortunately, repeat offenses. But the nation overall in that generation had rebelled against God, had turned their backs on him several times. God says, enough. I don't need you anymore. If you're not willing to obey, I'm going to rely on the next generation. I'm going to let the next guys, Caleb and Joshua, thankfully got the chance to be a part of it. The next generation got the chance to obey. And so God's in control. Even if it means skipping a generation, he's going to use the people that are obedient and willing to serve. We definitely don't want that to happen. We ask to be a part of God's service, but we know, you can see here, he's going to remember the next generation. He's going to keep using Israel. You will arise and have mercy on Zion. You're going to remember Jerusalem again. For the time of her favor, yea, the set time is coming. That's why I referenced that earlier. Let's see here, Jeremiah 25:11 and 12, and Jeremiah 29:10. Those are two different verses where Jeremiah specifically says it's going to be 70 years till Israel comes back. And so that was a promise that they made. Again, Jeremiah's writings, as just a technical academic thing. Daniel didn't see them until much later. Daniel was a little bit older in Babylon, and he found these and said, whoa, wow, this is amazing. God's got a plan. So whenever this was written, we don't know exactly for sure, but Jeremiah specifically, God gave him the insight to say it's going to be 70 years, and that's exactly what it was. After Babylon was punished for all that they had done, the Persians came in, and Cyrus said, hey, you don't have to be here. Go back and build Jerusalem. And so God had all that worked out. And that's what it's talking about here in verse 13. The time of her favor, the time of God saying, Jerusalem, okay, it's time for you to be rebuilt again. That's the time that's come. The set time is now. God's servants, the people of Israel, thy servants, verse 14, they will take pleasure in stones and favor in dust. How many of us like to tackle a messy house or a messy room or a messy backyard? It's a little overwhelming to begin with. You don't even want to, something, I'd rather not do this, okay? Think of Nehemiah. We did this, it was probably maybe a year ago we went through that book. What did he do the first night he got there? He got there with all those people. He got on a donkey and said, I'm going to go by myself. In fact, it was late at night, so he probably couldn't sleep. He jumped on his donkey and said, I'm going to check out Jerusalem. And all it was piles of rubble. In fact, it was so much rubble, the donkey couldn't even get through certain spots. He had to go on foot a few times. That was probably really discouraging. He had brought all these people with him. We don't know exactly how many. The king's soldiers to protect him. They came all the way out here to build a city, rebuild a wall, and it was a mess. And, I don't know about you, I sometimes think of certain projects and I think, okay, yeah, we could probably do this in 2 or 3 hours. And you get there and you go, man, my mind did not remember this picture well enough. I thought things were a lot better than the way they seemed. Whether Nehemiah was like that or not, I don't know. He hadn't been there for several decades, okay? But the promise here in verse 14 is God's people are going to come and they're going to want to be with that dust. They're going to want to be with those rocks. They're going to want to be with that rubble. They're going to want to have to clear that mess and say, you know what, this is what God wants us to do. This is not just a physical, let's rebuild this project, let's revitalize Jerusalem again. No, this was a spiritual thing for them. And so they did do it, and that's true. They took pleasure in it, and they got it done. They built the wall. The heathen will fear the name of the Lord. The kings of the earth will glorify the Lord, in verse 15. And that's exactly what happened in Nehemiah 6:16. They got done with the wall, and all those, you remember the story, that all those naysayers, all the people that even tried to kill Nehemiah and destroy what they were trying to do and threaten them, they were upset. They glorified God in their complaints. They were upset and said, God's with them. I don't like it, but God's with them, This makes me think, too, I start thinking of a secondary application to God's going to rebuild Jerusalem again another time. He's going to do it again. He's going to, at the very least, update it, whether it needs to be fixed or not, I don't know for sure. We don't know what God has planned. But I think of the future. Revelation 11:15 is a reference where God comes back and fixes up Jerusalem. He rebuilds it in such a way that it is so glorious and so amazing that the whole world wants to go and say, we got to check out Jerusalem, So Revelation 11:15 is another one of those. Then it says in verse 16, when the Lord shall build up Zion, he shall appear in his glory. God didn't appear in his glory when Nehemiah rebuilt it. That was God's will. God wanted him to do that. That was a very special thing. But that wasn't when God came back yet. He didn't come back in a flaming ball of fire or come down in his chariot and say, wow, you rebuilt Jerusalem, this is amazing. He didn't do that then. So we can expect that to happen in the future. Again, that's something that we might get to see firsthand. God coming back in his glory as he rebuilds Jerusalem. And finally, verse 17, he will regard the prayer of the destitute and not despise their prayer. In contrast with what this author had just recently seen before writing this psalm, he had seen the destitute, the broken, the hurting, those that were despised. He saw them trampled. He saw them taken into captivity. He saw terrible things happen to very vulnerable people. He saw families destroyed, buildings burned. He saw God's people touched and hurt by the Babylonians. And when the time comes for God to rebuild Jerusalem in the end times, when Nehemiah came back to rebuild Jerusalem in Nehemiah's time, the destitute, those that were despised, they were listened to. They were heard. God answered their prayer. God allowed that fulfillment to occur then. And so that's something we look forward to. I think this psalm especially is so encouraging. I think of Hannah's prayer we looked at on Sunday. Same deal. Man's strength can't prevail. Ultimately, God has sent a Messiah. He sent an anointed one. He has sent one. He has promised He's going to make all things right. It might seem we're losing, in a sense, losing the battle, but He wins the war. And again, I don't want to make that seem as a cliche thing. We know what the end looks like, and even in the midst of just all this sorrow, all this, again, physical impacts of just being sick to our stomachs of what's going on, God says, well, it might look bad now, but I've got a plan. I'm going to come back and make all things right. I'm going to rebuild. We don't have a connection with Jerusalem specifically, but we know that's God's center. And Jesus Christ is going to be there someday. We get to go there. I don't know about you. I think, well, I do know. The Battle of Armageddon is going to be right in that area. That's what we come down to. So maybe we're going to be permanent residents of Jerusalem for 1,000 years. Hopefully we get to take a quick trip to Tobacco County someday, maybe. I don't know. Maybe we want to see this place again. I don't know what it's going to look like. But we're going to get to be there. We're going to be there with Jesus Christ and see Him and see how He works. And that's a promise. We can count on that. So any comments or questions or additions to those first 17 verses of Psalm 102?
Lets us know that no matter what it looks like, we're still sitting on His throne, and not all shook up about things.
No? Yeah, it's true.
He's going to make things right.
Yep. I think that's the big takeaway. When Larry was saying, it made me think of I forgot to mention that last verse, the word destitute. Literally means the word naked, those that are in the most vulnerable state. And the only other time that word is used in the Old Testament is in Jeremiah 17:6, and it talks about that word there is translated as what's called a heath, or a very small shrub that would have lived in the desert, survived in the desert. And it says it in this verse here, it says, "For he shall be like the heath," or this short plant, "in the desert, and shall not see when good cometh, but shall inhabit the parched places in the wilderness, in a salt land, and not inhabited." And that's speaking of people. It's speaking of a small group of people that are in Israel that are, even at the very end, are still going to refuse to say Jesus Christ was the Messiah. And they're going to live in a spiritual desert because they don't know their Messiah has come. And I just saw, just watching something about some interaction with some Jewish people online recently, and just they're in darkness. It's sad. They're God's people, and they still don't understand that they got more promises in this book than I do, and I'm one of His children, And they got so much to look forward to, so much excitement to just be overwhelmed by, and unfortunately, they're just like the lost. They're like a physically dying plant, because they don't know where their true source is. But we do, and we know who wins at the end, and like Larry was saying, that's good. Very, very important.